What happens when a powerful man thinks he can break someone who's already been forged in fire? Captain Derek Morrison was about to learn that some people don't just survive hell, they master it. Behind quiet eyes and a humble uniform stood someone whose training had prepared her for enemies far more dangerous than a bully with rank. This is the true story of how one violent kick became the beginning of a captain's downfall, and how a Navy SEAL proved that real strength doesn't need to announce itself. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Sometimes justice comes not from courtrooms or complaints, but from the cold, calculated precision that only the world's most elite warriors possess. The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Petty Officer First Class Sarah Chen walked toward the administrative building. Her boots clicked rhythmically against the polished concrete, each step measured and purposeful. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another sailor reporting for duty, but appearances could be deceiving. Sarah had learned long ago that blending in was often the most powerful tool in her arsenal. At 5 feet 6 inches tall with an athletic but not imposing build, she moved through the world with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform was pressed to perfection. Nothing about her screamed special operations, and that was exactly how she preferred it. 3 years earlier, Sarah had become one of only a handful of women to complete the grueling Navy SEAL training program. The months of Hell Week, underwater demolitions, and psychological warfare had stripped away every weakness and rebuilt her into something harder than steel. But, unlike many of her male counterparts who wore their achievement like a badge of honor, Sarah kept her accomplishments quiet. She had learned that in a world still adjusting to women in combat roles, it was better to let her actions speak louder than her credentials. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now found herself assigned to what many would consider a mundane administrative role. After completing 2 successful deployments in classified operations that she could never discuss, Sarah had requested a stateside assignment to complete her degree in international relations. The Navy had granted her request, placing her in the Personnel Department of Naval Station Norfolk. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, a chance to decompress and plan her next career move. As she entered the building, Sarah nodded to the security guard, a friendly older man named Rodriguez who always had a smile and a joke ready. He had no idea that the young woman greeting him each morning had infiltrated terrorist cells, eliminated high-value targets, and completed missions that existed only in heavily classified files. To him, she was just Sarah, the polite petty officer who always remembered to ask about his grandchildren. The administrative offices buzzed with the typical morning energy of a large military installation. Sailors hurried between meetings, phones rang constantly, and the smell of coffee mixed with the sterile scent of government buildings everywhere. Sarah made her way to her desk in the personnel records section, where her job involved processing transfer requests, updating service records, and handling various administrative tasks that kept the massive naval operation running smoothly. Her supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Martinez, was already at his desk reviewing the day's assignments. Martinez was a good man who had served 22 years in the Navy, mostly on destroyers and cruisers. He respected Sarah's work ethic and attention to detail, though he had often wondered how someone with her obvious intelligence and capability had ended up in an administrative role. Sarah had never volunteered information about her background, and Martinez respected the Navy's culture of not prying into someone's service record without need to know. The morning proceeded like most others. Sarah processed a stack of transfer requests, updated several service records, and helped a young seaman navigate the paperwork required to add his new wife to his dependent benefits. She approached each task with the same methodical precision that had kept her alive in places where mistakes meant death. Even in this peaceful environment, old habits died hard. Around 10:30, the routine was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Derek Morrison. Sarah had heard about Morrison before she had ever seen him. His reputation preceded him like a storm front, and none of the stories were particularly flattering. Morrison was known throughout the base as someone who ruled through intimidation and barely controlled anger. He was old school in the worst possible way, someone who confused fear with respect and believed that being loud made him right. Morrison had been passed over for promotion to Rear Admiral twice, a fact that had done nothing to improve his temperament. At 52 years old, he was running out of time to advance his career, and the frustration showed in every interaction. He commanded the base's personnel division, which gave him authority over hundreds of sailors, and he used that authority like a weapon. When Morrison entered the office that morning, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Conversations died mid-sentence, and everyone suddenly found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. The captain was a large man, standing 6 feet 3 inches tall with broad shoulders that he carried like a threat. His uniform was always immaculate, his gray hair perfectly styled, and his face set in a perpetual scowl that suggested the world was constantly disappointing him. Sarah watched him from her peripheral vision as he moved through the office. She had dealt with men like Morrison before, both in the military and in the dangerous places where her real work had taken her. She recognized the type immediately, someone who had probably been competent once but had let power corrupt him into something ugly. These kinds of leaders were dangerous not because they were strong, but because they were weak and trying to hide it behind aggression. Morrison stopped at Chief Martinez's desk and began discussing some issue with staffing schedules. Sarah could hear his voice rising as he became agitated about something Martinez had apparently failed to handle to his satisfaction. The conversation grew more heated, and Sarah found herself unconsciously cataloging exit routes and potential threats, habits that were impossible to turn off even in supposedly safe environments. The argument between Morrison and Martinez continued for several minutes before the captain stormed out of the office, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension that would linger for the rest of the morning. Martinez looked embarrassed and frustrated, clearly struggling with the challenge of serving under an officer who seemed to take pleasure in making others miserable. Sarah returned her attention to her work, but she filed away her observations about Morrison for future reference. In her experience, bullies like him eventually showed their true nature to everyone around them. It was just a matter of time before someone became a target, and when that happened, it was better to be prepared. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Sarah completed her assigned tasks with her usual efficiency and helped several other sailors with various administrative issues. She ate lunch alone in the base cafeteria, preferring her own company to the small talk and gossip that dominated most group conversations. Solitude had become comfortable during her years in special operations, where trusting the wrong person could have fatal consequences. After lunch, Sarah was working on updating a complex service record when she overheard two other petty officers discussing Captain Morrison. They were speaking in hushed tones, but her trained hearing picked up fragments of their conversation. Apparently, Morrison had a history of targeting specific individuals for harassment, usually picking on people who couldn't fight back effectively. The pattern was disturbingly familiar to Sarah, who had seen similar behavior from corrupt officials in hostile territories. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah became increasingly aware that her quiet assignment might not remain quiet for much longer. Captain Morrison was the kind of powder keg that eventually exploded, and, when it did, anyone in his vicinity was likely to become collateral damage. She had survived too much to let a petty tyrant derail her career or her plans for the future. The workday ended at 1700 hours, and Sarah gathered her materials with the same systematic approach she brought to everything else. As she prepared to leave, Chief Martinez approached her desk. He looked tired and stressed, clearly still bothered by his morning encounter with Morrison. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I want you to know that what happened this morning had nothing to do with your work. You've been doing an excellent job here, and I appreciate your professionalism." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext of his words. Martinez was worried that Morrison might eventually turn his attention to her, and he was trying to provide whatever protection he could through official channels. She appreciated the gesture, even though she knew that if Morrison decided to target her, there would be little that Martinez or anyone else could do to stop him through normal administrative procedures. As Sarah walked to her car that evening, she reflected on her current situation. She had requested this assignment to have a peaceful transition period, a chance to plan her next move and, maybe even experience something resembling a normal life. But peace was apparently not in the cards, at least not while serving under Captain Morrison. The irony was bitter but not surprising. Sarah had faced down terrorists, survived firefights in hostile territories, and completed missions that had helped keep her country safe. But now her biggest threat came not from foreign enemies, but from a petty tyrant wearing the same uniform she wore. It was a reminder that danger could come from anywhere, even from those who were supposed to be on the same side. That night, as Sarah sat in her small apartment reviewing her options, she made a decision that would prove prophetic. If Captain Morrison wanted to make someone's life difficult, he had chosen the wrong target. Sarah Chen had been forged in fires that would have broken most people, and she had learned lessons that couldn't be taught in any traditional military school. Morrison might have rank and authority, but Sarah had something far more dangerous: the skills, training, and mindset of someone who had earned the right to call herself a Navy SEAL. If he pushed too hard, he was going to discover that some people don't just fight back, they fight back with a precision and effectiveness that can destroy everything their opponent holds dear. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test both Morrison's abuse of power and Sarah's ability to remain professional under extreme provocation. Neither of them knew it yet, but their paths were about to intersect in a way that would forever change both of their careers and their lives. In her apartment that night, Sarah completed her normal evening routine with the same attention to detail that characterized everything else in her life. She worked out, maintained her gear, and reviewed the day's events with an analytical eye that most people would have found exhausting. But, for someone trained to operate in life or death situations, constant vigilance was not paranoia, it was survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Sarah would meet them with the same quiet professionalism that had carried her through everything else. She had no way of knowing that within a few weeks, her carefully controlled world would explode into chaos, and she would be forced to make decisions that would test every principle she held dear. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, she would rest, prepare, and maintain the readiness that had become second nature. Because in Sarah's experience, trouble rarely announced itself in advance. When it came fast, and only those who were truly prepared would survive with their honor and their lives intact. 2 weeks after her first observation of Captain Morrison's behavior, Sarah began to notice a disturbing pattern developing in the personnel office. The captain had started making more frequent visits, ostensibly to check on various administrative matters, but his real purpose was becoming increasingly clear to those who knew how to recognize predatory behavior. Morrison had developed what he probably thought was a subtle routine of finding fault with the work of specific individuals. He would arrive unannounced, demand to see certain files or reports, and then launch into tirades about imaginary mistakes or procedural violations. His targets were always people he perceived as vulnerable: junior enlisted personnel, sailors who were new to the base, or anyone who seemed unlikely to fight back effectively. Sarah watched these performances with the analytical eye of someone trained to read people and situations. Morrison was textbook workplace predator, someone who fed off the fear and discomfort of others. He carefully chose his moments and his victims, always ensuring that he had plausible deniability for his behavior while maximizing the psychological impact on his targets. The first time Morrison turned his attention directly to Sarah, it was over something completely trivial. She had processed a routine transfer request according to standard procedures, but Morrison claimed that she had used the wrong form revision date. The accusation was ridiculous. Sarah had triple-checked her work as always, and the form was correct, but Morrison spent 15 minutes berating her in front of the entire office. Sarah stood at attention throughout the tirade, her face impassive and her responses limited to yes, sir and understood, sir. Internally, however, she was making careful observations about Morrison's behavior patterns, his body language, and the way he structured his attacks. Information was always useful, and Sarah had learned long ago that knowledge was often the most effective weapon. When Morrison finally finished his performance and stormed out of the office, the reaction from her colleagues was immediate and telling. Several people approached Sarah to offer quiet support and to assure her that everyone knew Morrison's accusations were baseless. Chief Martinez looked mortified and angry, clearly frustrated by his inability to protect his people from their commanding officer's abuse. "I'm sorry about that, Sarah," Martinez said privately after the other sailors had returned to their work. "Morrison's been getting worse lately. I think the stress of being passed over for promotion again is getting to him." Sarah nodded politely, but privately she disagreed with Martinez's assessment. What she had witnessed wasn't stress, it was calculated abuse. Morrison knew exactly what he was doing, and he was enjoying it. The fact that he had chosen her as a target suggested that he had done some research into her background and believed he had found someone who wouldn't fight back. That assumption would prove to be a costly mistake. Over the following week, Morrison's attention to Sarah intensified. He began nitpicking every aspect of her work, demanding explanations for perfectly routine decisions, and requiring her to redo assignments that had been completed correctly the first time. His behavior was clearly designed to frustrate her, wear down her confidence, and establish his dominance over her daily work life. Sarah responded to each new demand with the same professional courtesy she had shown from the beginning. She made the requested changes without complaint, provided the demanded explanations with patience, and maintained the kind of military bearing that would have made her drill instructors proud. But, beneath the surface, she was conducting a thorough intelligence assessment of her opponent. Morrison's patterns were becoming clear. He preferred to launch his attacks when there were witnesses, maximizing the public humiliation factor. He never put his most unreasonable demands in writing, keeping everything verbal so that there would be no paper trail of his harassment. He was careful to frame his abuse as legitimate military leadership, using phrases like maintaining standards and attention to detail to justify his behavior. Most tellingly, Morrison seemed to enjoy the discomfort he created in others. Sarah had seen that particular expression before, in the faces of men who took pleasure in exercising power over people they perceived as helpless. It was a look that had motivated her to eliminate more than one target during her classified operations. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early March. Sarah arrived at work to find Morrison waiting at her desk, holding a file folder and wearing the kind of smile that preceded bad news. He had apparently arrived early specifically to confront her, which suggested a level of premeditation that transformed his behavior from mere bullying into something more systematic and dangerous. "Petty Officer Chen," Morrison said loudly enough for everyone in the office to hear, "I've been reviewing your work from last week, and I'm finding some serious deficiencies in your attention to detail." Sarah stood at attention, waiting for him to specify the alleged problems. She knew with absolute certainty that her work had been flawless, but she also knew that facts would be irrelevant to whatever Morrison had planned. Morrison opened the folder and pulled out several transfer requests that Sarah had processed the previous week. He made a show of examining them closely, as if discovering problems for the first time. In reality, Sarah realized he had probably spent considerable time the night before looking for anything he could twist into a criticism. "These signatures are not properly aligned with the signature blocks," Morrison announced, pointing to documents that were perfectly acceptable by any reasonable standard. "And this date format doesn't follow the regulation exactly. This kind of sloppy work is unacceptable in my command." Sarah kept her expression neutral as she listened to Morrison's litany of imaginary faults. The signatures were properly placed, the dates were in the correct format, and every document met or exceeded Navy standards. But she understood that this confrontation wasn't really about paperwork, it was about power and control. "Sir, these documents were prepared according to the current regulations," Sarah said calmly. "If there are specific changes you'd like me to make, I'm happy to address them." Morrison's face reddened at her response. Sarah's calm professionalism was clearly not the reaction he had been hoping for. He had expected her to become flustered, apologetic, or defensive. Instead, she was treating his abuse like a routine administrative issue, which robbed him of the emotional payoff he was seeking. "Are you questioning my judgment, petty officer?" Morrison snapped, his voice rising to a level that ensured everyone in the office was paying attention. "Because it sounds like you think you know better than your commanding officer." This was the moment Sarah recognized as a critical decision point. Morrison was escalating the confrontation, trying to provoke her into a response that would justify more severe retaliation. He was essentially daring her to challenge his authority, confident that his rank would protect him from any consequences. "No, sir," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm not questioning your judgment. I'm simply stating that I followed established procedures. If you'd like me to modify my approach, I need specific guidance on what changes you require." The room had fallen completely silent. Everyone was watching to see how this confrontation would resolve. Sarah's response was perfectly military in its correctness. She was acknowledging Morrison's authority while subtly forcing him to specify exactly what he wanted her to do differently. It was a masterful example of using military protocol as both a shield and a weapon. Morrison realized that his trap hadn't worked as intended. Sarah's response left him with limited options. He could either admit that the documents were actually acceptable, or he could make increasingly unreasonable demands that would expose his harassment for what it really was. He chose poorly. "I don't like your tone, petty officer," Morrison said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "Maybe you need to learn some respect for proper military hierarchy. Report to my office at 1500 hours. We're going to have a private discussion about your attitude problem." Sarah felt a cold clarity settle over her mind, the same sensation she had experienced in hostile territories when situations turned dangerous. Morrison had just crossed a line by demanding a private meeting where there would be no witnesses to whatever he had planned. This wasn't harassment anymore, it was potentially something much worse. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice betraying nothing of the calculations running through her mind. She was already planning for multiple contingencies, considering everything from recording equipment to self-defense scenarios. Morrison had just escalated their conflict to a level where her special operations training might become relevant. As Morrison stalked out of the office, leaving behind an atmosphere of shocked tension, Sarah returned to her work with apparent calm. But, beneath the surface, she was conducting a rapid assessment of her situation and her options. Morrison had made it clear that he intended to isolate her and escalate his abuse, which meant that the time for passive resistance was rapidly coming to an end. Chief Martinez approached her desk a few minutes later, his expression grave. "Sarah, I don't like where this is heading. Morrison's been getting more aggressive with everyone lately, but what just happened was over the line." Sarah looked up from her computer screen, her expression serious but controlled. "Chief, I appreciate your concern, but I can handle Captain Morrison. I've dealt with difficult people before." Martinez studied her face for a moment, perhaps sensing something in her demeanor that he couldn't quite identify. "I know you're tough, Sarah, but Morrison has rank and authority. If this gets worse, there are proper channels." "I understand the proper channels," Sarah interrupted gently. "And I'll use them if necessary. But right now, I need to focus on doing my job and maintaining military standards." What Sarah didn't tell Martinez was that she had already begun considering alternatives to official channels. Her experience in special operations had taught her that sometimes the proper channels were inadequate for dealing with truly dangerous people. And Morrison was becoming dangerous not just to her, but potentially to other sailors who might be less equipped to defend themselves. As the day progressed toward her commanded appointment with Morrison, Sarah made several discreet preparations. She ensured that her personal belongings were secure, reviewed the layout of Morrison's office and the surrounding areas, and mentally rehearsed several different scenarios for how their meeting might unfold. She also made one phone call during her lunch break, contacting a former teammate who now worked in naval intelligence. The conversation was brief and seemingly casual, but it served to alert someone in the special operations community that Sarah might be facing a problem that could require intervention. In the world of classified operations, such informal networks often provided protection that official channels couldn't match. At exactly 1500 hours, Sarah knocked on Captain Morrison's office door. His gruff enter summoned her into what felt like a trap waiting to spring. Morrison's office was larger than most, befitting his rank, with a massive desk positioned to intimidate visitors and walls covered with plaques and photographs celebrating his long but unremarkable career. Morrison didn't look up immediately when Sarah entered and stood at attention in front of his desk. Instead, he continued reviewing paperwork, a power play designed to emphasize her relative unimportance. Sarah waited patiently, using the time to observe details about the office layout, potential escape routes, and anything that might be useful if the situation deteriorated. When Morrison finally looked up, his expression was cold and predatory. Sarah recognized the look immediately. She had seen it in the faces of men who believed they had cornered helpless prey. It was an expression that had preceded violence in other contexts, and she began shifting into a mental state that her instructors had called controlled readiness. "Close the door, Petty Officer Chen," Morrison said, his voice carrying an undertone that made the simple command sound like a threat. Sarah complied, noting that Morrison had positioned himself so that he would be between her and the exit. It was another calculated move designed to emphasize his control over the situation. But Morrison didn't understand that he was dealing with someone who had been trained to assess and counter such tactics automatically. "Sit down," Morrison commanded, gesturing to a chair position directly in front of his desk. The chair was lower than his, another psychological manipulation designed to make her feel small and vulnerable. Sarah remained standing. "Sir, if you're going to counsel me on my performance, I prefer to stand at attention." Morrison's eyes flashed with anger at her refusal to comply with his choreographed intimidation. "I said sit down, petty officer. That wasn't a suggestion." Sarah sat, but she chose her position carefully, maintaining balance and keeping her options open. Morrison interpreted her compliance as submission, which was exactly what she wanted him to think. Throughout her career, Sarah had learned that allowing opponents to underestimate her was often the most effective strategy. "We need to discuss your attitude problem," Morrison began, his voice taking on the tone of someone who believed he held all the cards. "Your disrespectful behavior this morning was unacceptable, and it's part of a pattern I've been observing since you arrived here." Sarah listened without responding, allowing Morrison to reveal more about his intentions and his character. She was gathering intelligence on an opponent who didn't realize he was being analyzed by someone with extensive training in psychological warfare. Morrison continued his monologue, building toward whatever climax he had planned for this meeting. His complaints were entirely fabricated, but they were delivered with the kind of conviction that suggested he had convinced himself they were legitimate. Sarah recognized this as another dangerous sign Morrison wasn't just abusing his authority, he was losing touch with reality. As the meeting progressed, Morrison's behavior became increasingly erratic and inappropriate. He began making personal comments about Sarah's appearance and her fitness for military service. His language became more aggressive, and his body language shifted in ways that triggered every alarm bell in Sarah's highly trained instincts. Sarah realized that she was dealing with someone who was not just a bully, but potentially a genuine threat to her safety and the safety of other sailors under his command. Morrison's behavior was escalating toward something that could no longer be handled through normal military channels or professional courtesy. The moment of truth was rapidly approaching, and Sarah began preparing herself for whatever form it might take. She had hoped to complete this assignment quietly and move on to the next phase of her career without incident. But Captain Morrison had apparently decided to test exactly what a Navy SEAL was capable of when pushed beyond reasonable limits. He was about to get an education that would change both of their lives forever. The atmosphere in Captain Morrison's office had grown increasingly toxic as their meeting stretched beyond 30 minutes. What had begun as a fabricated performance evaluation had devolved into something that resembled an interrogation more than military counseling. Morrison had abandoned any pretense of professionalism, and his behavior was becoming more aggressive with each passing minute. Sarah remained seated in the uncomfortable chair, maintaining perfect military bearing despite the increasingly hostile environment. Internally, however, she was conducting a continuous threat assessment, cataloging every detail that might become relevant if Morrison's behavior escalated further. His breathing was becoming labored, his face was flushed with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists as he paced behind his desk. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you?" Morrison snarled, his voice carrying a level of personal animosity that went far beyond any professional disagreement. "I've seen your type before. Think because you're educated and polite that you can look down on officers who've earned their rank through years of real service." Sarah recognized the irony in Morrison's accusation. If he only knew her real background, he would understand that she had earned her rank through experiences that made his administrative career look like a vacation. But revealing her SEAL training would only escalate an already dangerous situation, so she maintained her silence and continued to observe. Morrison stopped pacing and leaned forward on his desk, his bulk looming over Sarah in what was clearly intended as an intimidating gesture. "When I was coming up through the ranks, sailors knew how to show proper respect to their superiors. Maybe you need a reminder about how military discipline really works." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her body automatically shifting into a higher state of readiness. Her muscles tensed slightly, her breathing became more controlled, and her mind began calculating distances, angles, and potential responses to various scenarios. These were involuntary responses drilled into her through thousands of hours of training, and they activated whether she was facing foreign terrorists or domestic bullies. "Sir," Sarah said calmly, "I believe I've shown appropriate respect for your rank and position." If you have specific concerns about my performance, I'm prepared to address them through proper channels. Morrison's face darkened at her continued composure. Sarah's refusal to be intimidated was clearly infuriating him, which only confirmed her assessment that he was someone who fed off the fear of others. When that fear wasn't forthcoming, he was left without his primary psychological weapon. Proper channels? Morrison repeated mockingly. You still don't get it, do you? I am the proper channels. I decide what happens to your career, where you get assigned, and whether you have a future in this Navy. And, right now, I'm thinking you don't. Sarah understood that Morrison was escalating the confrontation beyond simple harassment. He was now making explicit threats against her career and her future, which crossed legal lines that could have serious consequences for him if properly documented. Unfortunately, they were alone in his office with no witnesses, which was clearly his intention. Morrison moved around his desk, ostensibly to retrieve a file from a cabinet, but Sarah noticed that his new position cut off her direct path to the door. It was another calculated move designed to emphasize his control over the situation, but it also represented a tactical error. Morrison was thinking like a bully rather than someone trained in actual combat, and that difference would prove significant if the situation continued to deteriorate. I've been reviewing your service record, Morrison continued, opening a file folder that Sarah realized contained her personnel information. Very interesting reading. Lot of classified entries, redacted sections. Makes me wonder what kind of strings you pulled to get such a cushy assignment here. Sarah felt a cold warning run through her mind. Morrison's access to her service record was legitimate given his position, but his probing into classified aspects of her background suggested that he was trying to find ammunition he could use against her. The fact that he couldn't see the details of her Special Operations Service was clearly frustrating him, which made him even more unpredictable. My assignment here was handled through standard personnel procedures, Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the growing danger she sensed in Morrison's behavior. If you have questions about my qualifications, they can be addressed through the appropriate administrative channels. Morrison slammed the file folder shut with enough force to make the sound echo through the office. There you go again with that attitude. You think you can hide behind regulations and procedures, but I've got news for you. In my command, I make the rules. The situation was rapidly approaching a critical decision point. Morrison's behavior had moved beyond harassment into territory that Sarah recognized as genuinely dangerous. His isolation tactics, escalating aggression, and abandonment of military protocol all pointed towards someone who was preparing to do something that would cross significant legal and ethical lines. Sarah began considering her options. She could attempt to de-escalate the situation through continued professional courtesy, but Morrison's behavior suggested that he was beyond rational conversation. She could demand to leave, but Morrison's position between her and the door made that potentially problematic. She could wait for him to make the first physical move, but that would mean allowing him to choose the time and method of attack. As these calculations ran through her mind, Morrison made his next move. He walked closer to Sarah's chair, positioning himself directly in front of her in what was clearly intended as an intimidating show of physical dominance. The distance between them was now less than 3 feet, well within what any reasonable person would consider threatening proximity. Stand up, Morrison ordered, his voice carrying a tone that made it clear this wasn't a routine military command. Sarah complied, rising smoothly from the chair while maintaining her balance and keeping her options open. Morrison was now close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the perspiration on his forehead. His pupils were dilated, and his breathing was rapid as signs that he was in an emotional state where rational decision-making was compromised. You're going to learn some respect, Morrison said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. One way or another. Sarah realized that they had reached the point of no return. Morrison was clearly preparing to escalate their confrontation into physical territory, and she would have to decide how to respond. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, but the context made her choices complicated. Morrison was still her commanding officer, regardless of his behavior, and any response she made would have consequences that extended far beyond this office. Morrison reached out suddenly, placing his hand on Sarah's shoulder in what might have appeared to be a gesture of authority but felt distinctly inappropriate given the context of their conversation. The contact was unwelcome, uninvited, and clearly designed to assert physical dominance over her. "Sir," Sarah said firmly, "I need you to remove your hand." Morrison's grip tightened instead of loosening, and his other hand moved toward her other shoulder. Sarah recognized the positioning as a prelude to either shoving or grabbing her more aggressively. Every instinct trained into her through years of special operations was now screaming warnings, and she knew that the situation was about to explode into open conflict. "You don't give orders to me," Morrison hissed, his face now only inches from hers. "You're about to learn." Morrison never finished his sentence. In one fluid motion, Sarah stepped back and, to the side, breaking his grip on her shoulder while simultaneously positioning herself for defensive action. The movement was so smooth and professional that Morrison didn't immediately realize what had happened. "Sir, this meeting is over," Sarah said calmly, moving toward the door with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been trained to extract herself from dangerous situations. "If you have further concerns about my performance, please put them in writing and we can address them through proper military channels." Morrison's face flushed red with rage as he realized that Sarah was attempting to leave without his permission. His carefully planned intimidation session was falling apart, and his authority was being challenged in a way that his ego couldn't tolerate. "You don't walk away from me!" Morrison shouted, lunging forward to block her path to the door. This was the moment that would change everything. Morrison had made the fatal decision to use physical force to prevent Sarah from leaving, crossing the line from harassment and intimidation into assault and false imprisonment. In doing so, he had triggered responses that had been drilled into Sarah through some of the most intensive training programs in the world. Sarah's reaction was instantaneous and precise. As Morrison moved to grab her arm, she executed a defensive technique that redirected his momentum while placing him in a position where he could no longer threaten her. The movement was so fast and efficient that Morrison found himself face down on his office carpet before his mind could process what had happened. But Morrison's humiliation and anger overrode any sense of self-preservation or rational thought. Instead of staying down and reconsidering his actions, he pushed himself up and spun around to face Sarah with murder in his eyes. "You just assaulted a superior officer." Morrison screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he lost complete control of his emotions. "You're finished in this Navy." Sarah stood calmly near the door, her posture alert but non-threatening. "Sir, you attempted to physically restrain me when I tried to leave this meeting. I defended myself using minimum necessary force. I recommend that we both take time to cool down and reconsider this situation." Morrison's response was to charge at her like a maddened bull, his size and weight behind a clumsy attack that would have seriously injured anyone without defensive training. But Sarah wasn't anyone. She was a Navy SEAL who had survived combat with trained killers, and Morrison's amateur assault was almost laughably ineffective against someone with her skills. What happened next took less than 3 seconds but would be replayed in Morrison's nightmares for years to come. Sarah's defensive response was a masterpiece of controlled violence, using Morrison's own momentum and aggression against him while ensuring that she used only the minimum force necessary to neutralize his attack. Morrison found himself on the floor again, but this time he was not getting back up quickly. His shoulder was dislocated, his nose was bleeding, and he was gasping for breath like a fish out of water. The physical pain was intense, but the psychological impact was devastating. In less than 3 seconds, Morrison had been completely neutralized by someone half his size, and the illusion of his power and authority had been shattered beyond repair. Sarah stood over him, her breathing barely elevated despite the physical altercation. "Sir, you need medical attention. I'm going to call for help." Morrison tried to speak but could only manage a weak groan. The fight had been knocked out of him in every possible sense, replaced by a dawning realization of what had just happened and what it meant for his career and his future. As Sarah reached for Morrison's desk phone to call for medical assistance, she reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. She had come to this assignment hoping for a quiet transition period, a chance to plan her next career move without drama or conflict. Instead, she had been forced to defend herself against a superior officer who had completely lost control of his emotions and his judgment. The irony was profound. Morrison had spent weeks trying to assert his dominance over someone he saw as vulnerable, never realizing that he was actually targeting one of the most dangerous people on the entire base. His misconceptions about power, authority, and strength had led him to make the worst decision of his career. As she waited for medical personnel to arrive, Sarah began mentally preparing for the investigation and hearings that would inevitably follow. Morrison's assault on her was witnessed by no one, but the physical evidence would tell its own story. More importantly, Sarah's background and training would eventually come to light, providing context for why Morrison's attack had ended so decisively in his disfavor. Captain Derek Morrison had started the day believing he could intimidate and control a subordinate through fear and violence. He was ending it flat on his back, injured and humiliated, having learned too late that some people cannot be bullied, intimidated, or controlled. Sarah Chen was one of those people, and Morrison was about to discover exactly what that meant for his future in the United States Navy. The medical response team arrived at Captain Morrison's office within 6 minutes of Sarah's call, finding a scene that immediately raised questions among the senior corpsmen who responded. Morrison was conscious but clearly in significant pain, with obvious injuries that suggested he had been in some type of physical altercation. Sarah stood calmly near the door, showing no signs of injury or distress, which created an obvious question about what exactly had transpired in the office. Chief Hospital Corpsman Rodriguez, the senior medical responder, was a 20-year veteran who had seen everything from bar fights to combat injuries. As he examined Morrison's dislocated shoulder and broken nose, he noticed details that told a story. The injuries were consistent with someone who had been quickly and efficiently neutralized by someone with significant training in hand-to-hand combat. Morrison's wounds were precise and effective, suggesting that whoever had inflicted them knew exactly what they were doing. "What happened here?" Rodriguez asked as his team prepared Morrison for transport to the base medical facility. Morrison, still struggling to breathe properly and speak clearly, attempted to provide his version of events. She attacked me," he gasped, pointing at Sarah with his uninjured arm. "Unprovoked assault on a superior officer." Rodriguez looked at Sarah, noting her calm demeanor and complete lack of defensive injuries. In his experience, when someone was attacked unprovoked, they usually showed some signs of the struggle, even if they ultimately prevailed. Sarah looked like someone who had just finished a routine administrative task. "Ma'am, do you need medical attention?" Rodriguez asked professionally. "No, Chief," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm uninjured." Rodriguez nodded and returned his attention to Morrison, who was being prepared for transport. As the medical team worked, Sarah provided a brief factual account of what had occurred, speaking in the precise, unemotional tone that she had learned during her classified debriefings. "Captain Morrison called me to his office for what he described as performance counseling," Sarah stated. "During the meeting, he became increasingly agitated and made physical contact with me against my wishes. When I attempted to leave the meeting, he physically prevented me from doing so and then attacked me. I defended myself using minimum necessary force to stop his assault." Rodriguez noted the military precision of Sarah's statement. She had provided the essential facts without elaboration or emotion, using language that suggested she had experience with official reports and investigations. Most sailors, when involved in an altercation with their commanding officer, would be emotional, defensive, or confused. Sarah sounded like someone giving a tactical briefing. As Morrison was loaded onto a stretcher for transport to the medical facility, he continued to insist that Sarah had attacked him without provocation. His version of events became increasingly incoherent as the pain medication began to take effect, but he repeatedly demanded that Sarah be arrested for assault on a superior officer. News of the incident spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Within an hour, everyone in the personnel division knew that Captain Morrison had been injured in some kind of confrontation with Petty Officer Chen. The reactions were mixed, with some people expressing shock that the quiet, professional Sarah would be involved in any kind of physical altercation, while others who had witnessed Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior wondered what had finally pushed him over the edge. Chief Martinez was among the first to be officially notified of the incident, receiving a call from the base security office requesting his immediate presence for initial questioning. As he hurried toward the security building, Martinez reflected on his observations of both Morrison and Sarah over the previous weeks. Morrison's behavior had been escalating steadily, while Sarah had maintained her professional demeanor despite obvious provocation. If there had been a physical confrontation between them, Martinez was confident that Morrison had been the aggressor. The initial investigation was handled by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, which took over the case due to the serious nature of the allegations. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, a 15-year veteran of NCIS, was assigned as the lead investigator. Walsh had handled hundreds of cases involving military personnel, from minor administrative violations to serious criminal charges, and she approached each case with the methodical thoroughness that had made her one of the most respected investigators in the service. Walsh's first step was to interview both parties separately, beginning with Captain Morrison at the base medical facility. Morrison was conscious and coherent by the time of the interview, though still heavily medicated for pain. His account of the incident painted Sarah as an insubordinate sailor who had violently attacked him when he attempted to counsel her on her poor performance and attitude. "She came into my office with an attitude from the beginning," Morrison insisted, his words slightly slurred by the medication. "Disrespectful, argumentative, completely unprofessional. When I tried to correct her behavior, she just snapped and attacked me. Completely unprovoked." Walsh took detailed notes while observing Morrison's demeanor and body language. She had interviewed hundreds of assault victims over her career, and Morrison didn't fit the typical pattern. Most genuine victims showed emotional responses consistent with having experienced a traumatic attack. Morrison seemed more angry than traumatized, more concerned with his authority being challenged than with his physical injuries. "Captain Morrison," Walsh said carefully, "can you walk me through exactly what happened immediately before the physical altercation began?" Morrison's account became vague and inconsistent when pressed for specific details. He claimed that Sarah had become increasingly hostile throughout their meeting, but he couldn't provide specific examples of what she had said or done that was inappropriate. His description of the actual physical confrontation was similarly unclear, suggesting either that his memory was impaired by the medication or that his version of events wasn't entirely accurate. Walsh's interview with Sarah took place later that same day in a conference room at the NCIS building. Sarah appeared precisely on time, in a perfectly pressed uniform, carrying a file folder that Walsh assumed contained relevant documents. Her demeanor was calm and professional, showing none of the nervous energy that typically characterized people involved in serious investigations. "Petty Officer Chen," Walsh began, "I need you to tell me, in your own words, what happened in Captain Morrison's office today." Sarah's account was detailed, precise, and delivered in the same emotionless tone that Rodriguez had noted earlier. She began with Morrison's pattern of harassment over the previous weeks, providing specific dates and examples of his inappropriate behavior. She described the escalation of his conduct during their meeting, including his physical contact and his attempt to prevent her from leaving. "When Captain Morrison grabbed my arm to prevent me from leaving," Sarah continued, "I informed him that the meeting was over and attempted to exit. He then launched himself at me in what I interpreted as an attempt to physically assault me. I defended myself using controlled defensive techniques designed to neutralize his attack while minimizing injury to him." Walsh was struck by several aspects of Sarah's testimony. First, her recall was extraordinarily detailed, including specific times, exact quotes, and precise descriptions of physical movements. Second, her language suggested familiarity with violence and defensive tactics that went beyond basic military training. Third, her emotional control was remarkable for someone who had just been involved in a career-threatening incident. "Petty Officer Chen," Walsh said, "your description of the defensive techniques you used is very specific. Do you have specialized training in hand-to-hand combat?" Sarah paused for a moment, and Walsh sensed that she was making a decision about how much information to reveal. "Yes, ma'am. I have received advanced defensive tactics training through various military programs." Walsh made a note to investigate Sarah's background more thoroughly. The vague reference to various military programs suggested that there might be classified aspects to Sarah's training that would require higher-level clearances to access. The physical evidence from Morrison's office told its own story. The furniture arrangement supported Sarah's claim that Morrison had positioned himself to block her exit. Scuff marks on the carpet were consistent with a brief, intense struggle. Most significantly, the pattern of Morrison's injuries suggested that he had been the aggressor in the altercation. His wounds were defensive in nature, consistent with someone who had been quickly and efficiently neutralized by someone with superior fighting skills. Dr. Patricia Williams, the base's chief medical officer, provided Walsh with a detailed analysis of Morrison's injuries. These wounds are consistent with someone who attacked another person and was decisively defeated, Williams explained. The dislocated shoulder occurs when someone lunges forward aggressively and has their momentum redirected. The broken nose is typical of someone who fell face-first after being thrown or taken down. If Petty Officer Chen had been the aggressor, we would expect to see different injury patterns. Walsh's investigation expanded to include interviews with other personnel who had worked with both Morrison and Sarah. The picture that emerged was damning for Morrison and supportive of Sarah's account. Multiple sailors described Morrison's increasingly erratic behavior, his pattern of targeting specific individuals for harassment, and his apparent obsession with establishing dominance over subordinates. Conversely, every person interviewed about Sarah described her as professional, competent, and respectful. Several people mentioned that they had witnessed Morrison's harassment of Sarah over the previous weeks and had been concerned about the escalating situation. None of them had seen any inappropriate behavior from Sarah. Chief Martinez provided particularly valuable testimony, describing his observations of Morrison's deteriorating behavior and his growing concern for the safety of his personnel. Captain Morrison had been getting progressively more aggressive with everyone, Martinez explained. But his focus on Petty Officer Chen was particularly intense. I was worried that something like this might happen. As Walsh delved deeper into Morrison's background, she discovered a pattern of behavior that extended beyond his current assignment. Previous fitness reports contained subtle references to leadership-style concerns and interpersonal challenges that suggested Morrison's abusive behavior was not a recent development. Several former subordinates, when contacted confidentially, provided accounts of Morrison's bullying and intimidation tactics dating back several years. The breakthrough in Walsh's investigation came when she received Sarah's complete service record, including the previously classified sections. What she discovered explained everything about how a petty officer had so decisively defeated a much larger commanding officer. Sarah Chen was not just another administrative sailor, she was a Navy SEAL with multiple classified deployments and specialized training in some of the most advanced combat techniques in the world. The classification level of Sarah's background required Walsh to bring in additional investigators with appropriate security clearances. What they found was a service record that read like something from a military thriller. Sarah had completed some of the most dangerous missions in recent military history, operating in hostile territories against enemies who would have killed her without hesitation. Her training included not just combat techniques, but psychological warfare, survival skills, and the kind of mental conditioning that created operators capable of functioning under extreme stress. Armed with this new information, Walsh understood why Morrison's assault had ended so decisively in his disfavor. Sarah hadn't just defended herself, she had responded with the automatic precision of someone trained to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. Morrison had essentially attacked one of the most dangerous people in the United States military, mistaking her quiet professionalism for weakness. The final piece of the investigation puzzle came when Walsh reviewed security camera footage from the hallway outside Morrison's office. While the cameras couldn't see inside the office itself, they clearly showed Sarah entering for the meeting at exactly 1500 hours, as ordered. More importantly, they showed Morrison arriving at his office nearly an hour early that day, suggesting that he had planned something special for their meeting. The footage also captured Sarah leaving Morrison's office in a calm, controlled manner and immediately using Morrison's desk phone to call for medical assistance. Her body language showed none of the agitation or distress that would be expected from someone who had just committed an unprovoked assault. Instead, she appeared to be someone who had just handled a routine emergency with professional competence. As Walsh compiled her final report, the picture was clear. Captain Derek Morrison had engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment against Petty Officer Sarah Chen, culminating in a sexual assault that had triggered a defensive response from someone uniquely qualified to protect herself. Morrison's injuries were the direct result of his own criminal behavior, and his claims of being the victim were contradicted by every piece of evidence that Walsh had uncovered. The investigation had revealed more than just the facts of one incident, it had exposed a pattern of abuse of authority that had been allowed to continue for years. Morrison's superiors had ignored warning signs and failed to protect the sailors under his command. The reckoning that was coming would extend far beyond Morrison himself. Sarah Chen had not just defended herself from a sexual predator, she had inadvertently triggered an investigation that would lead to significant changes in how the Navy dealt with abusive leaders. The quiet professional who had wanted only to complete her assignment in peace had instead become the catalyst for reforms that would protect future sailors from the kind of abuse that Morrison had represented. Morrison's career was effectively over, though he didn't know it yet. Sarah's was about to take an unexpected turn that would ultimately lead to opportunities she had never imagined. The confrontation that Morrison had initiated to establish his dominance had instead revealed the true character of both participants, with consequences that neither of them had anticipated. The weeks following the incident brought a cascade of consequences that transformed both Sarah's life and the entire command structure at Naval Station Norfolk. Special Agent Walsh's investigation had uncovered a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond Morrison's confrontation with Sarah, leading to a comprehensive review of leadership practices throughout the personnel division. Admiral Rebecca Harrison, the base commander, received Walsh's preliminary report on a Tuesday morning that would forever change her perspective on the command climate under her authority. Harrison was a highly respected officer who had earned her position through competence and integrity, but she was also someone who took personal responsibility for everything that happened under her command. The revelation that Morrison had been allowed to systematically abuse subordinates for years represented a failure of leadership that she was determined to correct. Harrison's first action was to remove Morrison from command immediately, pending the completion of the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings. Morrison's removal was handled quietly but decisively, with his temporary replacement announced as a routine administrative change. However, the real reason for his departure quickly became known throughout the base, adding to Morrison's humiliation and ensuring that his reputation would never recover. The Admiral's second action was to personally meet with Sarah Chen. Harrison had read the classified portions of Sarah's service record and was appalled that someone with such an exemplary background had been subjected to harassment by a petty tyrant who wasn't worthy to shine her boots. The meeting took place in Harrison's private office, away from the formal atmosphere of military protocol. Petty Officer Chen, Admiral Harrison began, "First, I want to apologize on behalf of this command for what you've endured. Captain Morrison's behavior was unacceptable, and it should have been stopped long before it escalated to the point where you were forced to defend yourself." Sarah maintained her professional bearing, but Harrison could see the relief in her eyes at finally being believed and supported by someone in authority. "Thank you, Admiral. I understand that these situations can be complex." Harrison studied Sarah for a moment, noting the same calm competence that had impressed everyone who had worked with her. "I've reviewed your complete service record, including the classified sections. Your background raises some questions about why you're in an administrative assignment that doesn't utilize your unique qualifications." Sarah had been wondering when this conversation would occur. Her SEAL background was now known to the investigation team, which meant it would eventually become known to her chain of command. She had always known that keeping such significant training secret would be difficult in the long term. "Admiral, I requested this assignment to complete my degree and plan my next career move," Sarah explained. "After multiple classified deployments, I felt I needed time and a stable environment to consider my options." Harrison nodded, understanding the challenges that special operations personnel faced when transitioning between high-stress assignments and normal military life. "I can appreciate that perspective. However, given recent events, I think we need to reconsider how we're utilizing your talents." The conversation that followed would set Sarah on a path she had never anticipated. Harrison explained that the investigation into Morrison's behavior had revealed systemic problems with leadership accountability throughout the base. Morrison had been able to abuse his authority for years because the existing oversight mechanisms were inadequate for detecting and stopping such behavior. "I'm creating a new position," Harrison explained, "someone who will work directly with my staff to review leadership practices, investigate complaints of misconduct, and ensure that what happened to you never happens to another sailor under my command. I want you to consider taking that position." Sarah was surprised by the offer. The role Harrison was describing would essentially make her an internal affairs investigator with significant authority and direct access to the base commander. It was the kind of position that could make enemies quickly, but it also represented an opportunity to prevent other sailors from experiencing what she had endured. "Admiral, I appreciate the confidence you're showing in me," Sarah replied carefully. "But I should point out that my background may make me controversial for such a role. My methods of dealing with Morrison weren't exactly conventional." Harrison smiled for the first time during their meeting. "Petty Officer Chen, your methods were exactly what the situation required. Morrison assaulted you, and you defended yourself with precisely the amount of force necessary to stop his attack. The fact that your training made his attack spectacularly unsuccessful is his problem, not yours." The legal proceedings against Morrison moved forward with the inexorable force of military justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including testimony from multiple witnesses, physical evidence, and Morrison's own inconsistent statements. His military attorney advised him to accept a plea agreement, but Morrison's ego wouldn't allow him to admit fault. The court-martial was held 6 weeks after the incident, drawing significant attention throughout the naval community. Cases involving senior officers accused of assaulting subordinates were rare, and the circumstances of this particular case made it even more noteworthy. Morrison's attorney attempted to portray his client as the victim of an unprovoked assault by a subordinate with dangerous training, but this strategy backfired spectacularly. Sarah's testimony was a masterpiece of factual precision and emotional control. She recounted Morrison's pattern of harassment, his escalating behavior during their final meeting, and his attempt to sexually assault her. Her description of the defensive techniques she had used was clinical and professional, demonstrating clearly that she had used the minimum force necessary to protect herself. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. They presented evidence of Morrison's abuse dating back several years, testimony from multiple victims, and expert analysis showing that Morrison's injuries were consistent with someone who had been the aggressor in the confrontation. The medical testimony was particularly damaging, with Dr. Williams explaining in detail how Morrison's wound patterns proved that he had been attacking when he was injured. Morrison's testimony on his own behalf was a disaster. Under cross-examination, he became increasingly agitated and defensive, revealing the same bullying personality that had caused the problems in the first place. His account of the incident was contradicted by physical evidence and his own previous statements. Most damaging of all, he made several disparaging comments about Sarah's gender and fitness for military service, demonstrating exactly the kind of discriminatory attitude that had motivated his harassment. The military panel deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges: assault, sexual harassment, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of authority. Morrison was sentenced to dismissal from the service, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and 2 years confinement. His 28-year military career was over, and he would leave the Navy in disgrace. Sarah watched the sentencing with mixed emotions. She felt vindicated by the verdict, but she also understood that Morrison's downfall represented a tragic waste of what might once have been a promising career. Power and authority had corrupted him into something ugly, and his inability to control his worst impulses had ultimately destroyed everything he had worked to achieve. The ripple effects of Morrison's court-martial extended throughout the Navy's leadership structure. Admiral Harrison used the case as a catalyst for implementing comprehensive reforms in how the service handled complaints of leadership misconduct. New reporting procedures were established, oversight mechanisms were strengthened, and training programs were expanded to help officers understand the legal and ethical boundaries of their authority. Sarah accepted Admiral Harrison's offer to lead the new Leadership Accountability Program. In her new role, she would work with commanders throughout the region to identify potential problems before they escalated to the point where sailors were harmed. It was challenging work that required diplomatic skills as well as investigative abilities, but Sarah found it rewarding to know that her efforts were protecting other service members. The irony of her situation was not lost on Sarah. She had come to Norfolk hoping for a quiet assignment that would allow her to plan her transition out of military service. Instead, Morrison's abuse had forced her to reveal her background and had led to a career opportunity that she found more fulfilling than anything she had done since leaving Special Operations. Morrison's disgrace became a cautionary tale throughout the Navy. His case was studied in leadership courses as an example of how abuse of authority could destroy careers and harm the service's mission. The fact that his downfall had come at the hands of someone he had underestimated and abused made the lesson even more powerful. Sarah's reputation within the Navy was permanently transformed by her handling of Morrison's assault. Word of her background spread through informal networks, earning her respect from peers who understood the significance of her training and accomplishments. More importantly, her professional handling of an impossible situation demonstrated leadership qualities that her superiors recognized and valued. 6 months after Morrison's court-martial, Sarah received notification that she had been selected for promotion to Chief Petty Officer, an advancement that came earlier than she had expected. The promotion was accompanied by orders to attend the Navy's senior leadership school, preparing her for increased responsibilities in her new role. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her career, she reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this point. Morrison's attempt to assert dominance over her had backfired spectacularly, leading to his own destruction and her unexpected advancement. The quiet professional who had simply wanted to do her job had instead become a symbol of how integrity and training could triumph over abuse and intimidation. Morrison, meanwhile, faced a very different future. After serving his confinement, he was released from military custody to face a civilian world that had no use for his particular combination of arrogance and incompetence. His military pension was forfeit, his benefits were gone, and his chances of finding employment commensurate with his previous position were virtually non-existent. The man who had once commanded hundreds of sailors and wielded significant authority now faced the prospect of starting over in his 50s with no transferable skills and a criminal record. His attempt to break someone he saw as weak had instead revealed his own fundamental weakness and had cost him everything he had spent decades building. Sarah's story became part of Navy lore, though the details were often distorted in the retelling. The basic facts remained consistent: a captain had tried to assault a subordinate and had learned too late that she was a Navy SEAL. The story served as both inspiration for those facing abuse and a warning for those tempted to abuse their authority. The long-term impact of the Morrison case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The reforms implemented in its wake created a more accountable leadership culture throughout the Navy, protecting countless sailors from the kind of abuse that Morrison had represented. Sarah's new role put her at the center of these reforms, allowing her to help shape the future of military leadership. Years later, when Sarah had advanced to senior leadership herself, she would often think about the moment when Morrison had made the fatal decision to assault her. In that instant, he had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed both of their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. His attempt to demonstrate power had instead revealed powerlessness, while her quiet professionalism had ultimately led to positions of genuine authority and influence. The lesson was clear: real strength didn't need to announce itself, real authority didn't require intimidation, and real power came from competence and integrity rather than rank and position. Captain Morrison had learned these lessons too late to save his career, but his disgrace had taught them to countless others who would lead more effectively because of his failure. Sarah Chen had entered Morrison's office as a target of harassment and had left as an agent of justice. Her journey from victim to leader demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous person in any conflict is the one who combines genuine capability with unshakable integrity. Morrison had discovered this truth in the most painful way possible, learning that when you attack someone forged in fire, you're likely to get burned.